From the Oklahoma newsroom, it's time for Thunder Thursday. I'm Jenny Carlson here with our Thunder beat writers, Brett Dawson, Eric Horn. Guys, 3 games to go in the regular season, and the Thunder is still not in the playoffs. It's not a sure thing, and Brett, they've got to win 2 to make it a for sure, and there's some tough ones still left out there for these guys.
2 wins, and they should win 2 of these games. Really, they should beat Miami on the road. And they definitely should beat Memphis at home next week in the season finale. At Houston, a little tricky. Don't know exactly what Houston will do in terms of resting players. Houston has very little to play for. Still might want some rhythm. Still might want to have some control over who it plays in the first round. Maybe it wants to avoid the Thunder, and you know we'll see how that goes. But the 2-1 record, they have to guarantee that they get in, they have to win 2. They can get in without 2 wins. They're just going to need some help from other people. And it's the same case with all their playoff positioning. They need help from other people. They can only secure the 8 themselves. They win out or they win 2 games, they're assured of getting the 8 seed. If they're going to get higher than that, they're going to need some help from other people to lose.
You know, you're talking about potentially the Thunder being the 8 seed, and there's prognosis out there. Our friend Barry Trammell, who's away today, couldn't be with us, wrote a blog about this, that the prediction site, 538, predicted the Thunder to be a 4 seed. Eric, I mean, it's not out of the realm of possibility, but it seems like they're not likely to be in that home court advantage first round group when the season's over.
Yeah, there's just so many tiebreakers that they've lost already that's going to put them in a difficult position to get there. You know, Utah is a team that's currently in the 4. That's a team that the Thunder will actually have an advantage over in terms of the tiebreaker because they beat them 3 times in the regular season. But everybody else basically who's in playoff contention, aside from the Clippers who are currently out of the playoffs, the Thunder's lost tiebreakers to. So they're just not in an advantageous position. They can still get up there. Ideally, it would be a situation where they would be best in the 4 or the 5. You know, a home playoff series, of course, they'd love to have. And then they'd avoid those top 3 seeds in Houston, Golden State, and in Portland. But at this point, if you can get a 5, considering that you don't have control of where you can go other than making the playoffs, the Thunder would have to feel pretty fortunate about that, considering how many games they've bungled this season.
Yeah, and you know, that obviously having home court, Brett, I mean, it'd be nice, but after that first round, you're not, even at the 4, you're not likely to be at home for the majority of your games. And that 4-5 matchup seems like that's going to be a much more advantageous matchup for the Thunder than, say, being 6 versus a 3 or 7 versus a 2. Yeah,
obviously if you fall down to 7 or 8, you got to play either Houston or Golden State. You don't want to have to do that. The 6 for you is dicey just because of the way Portland has kind of owned them, and particularly I don't think they'd get swept by Portland, who swept them in the regular season, but winning at Portland has been such a chore, and you'd have to win a game on the road in order to win that series. You get into a 4-5, not only do you have the chance, if you can get all the way to the 4, that you could host and have home court advantage, but there are matchups that feel a little better. San Antonio is going to be in the mix there. Utah is going to be in the mix there. Those are teams you match up with better than those other teams. So if you could get into one of those situations, even if you find a way in that 4-5 to if it's Minnesota, there are a lot of games, even though they lost 3 out of 4 to Minnesota in the regular season, mostly very competitive games. I think you feel good about those matchups. So 4-5 is where they want to be one way or the other. But they're going to have a lot of work to do, and beyond that, they just need some help.
You know, Eric, when you think about these matchups, obviously at this point, getting in is the primary thing at this point for the Thunder. But as you guys have talked, you know, these tiebreakers, it's sort of all over the map. There could be 2-way ties, 3-way ties, 4-way ties. Remind people how that could break down and where the Thunder could find the most advantageous situation with some of those tiebreakers.
Well, I just wrapped my head around it 5 minutes ago, so I should be the perfect person to ask this. Basically, when it comes down to these tiebreakers, it's head-to-head record, and then it's I believe a division record if you're in the same division and you're tied with somebody, and then it's a conference record, and then after conference record, it would be record against playoff qualifiers. So if all of those things line up and it gets down to playoff qualifiers, it will be the Thunder's record against the teams that they're tied with in the standings. If it would be Utah, Minnesota, San Antonio, and the Thunder all finished with the same record hypothetically, then it would be the Thunder's record against those teams. It would be a good thing if it was Utah and San Antonio they were tied with. It would be a bad thing if you throw Minnesota in there because the Thunder's lost 3 out of 4 to Minnesota. Same thing would apply if Denver were to somehow get into the playoffs. That would actually be better than a Minnesota tie because they've tied. They've played Denver 4 times and they've won 2 and lost 2. Yeah. But they don't have any tiebreakers against teams head-to-head other than Utah or the Clippers. So they're just not in a good position in terms of determining their own destiny. They're in the worst position in terms of determining their own destiny because they don't determine their own destiny. All they can do is ensure they get in the playoffs.
Yeah, I was going to say basically the only assurance is when you're in.
Yeah.
And Brett, at this point, that's where they are. Maybe, well, I don't know if it's a larger issue at this point, but definitely an issue is how this team is playing. Russell Westbrook, fantastic. Guys around him that need to be playing much better come playoff time, lots of questions right now. Probably Paul George most prime among them at this point.
Yeah, I mean, Paul George has shot the ball so poorly since the All-Star break. Sorry, my cold is rearing its
choked up about how badly
my
Paul
cold is
George
rearing
is shooting.
its ugly head now.
It's terrible.
So yeah, he shot the ball very poorly. He shot the ball exceptionally poorly lately. He told us the other night something's wrong. Something's wrong mechanically. He doesn't feel right when he shoots the ball. That's not an encouraging sign. The good sign for Paul George is he's done this a lot in his career. He's taken these big dips around this time of year, and then he's always kind of, he's kind of trended upward in the playoffs. The last 3 times his teams have made the playoffs, he shot better than 40% from three-point range, despite the fact that he went into a pretty significant shooting slump late in those regular seasons. So that's a good sign for the Thunder. The bad sign is that it has been so hard for him to get going. And then Carmelo Anthony, who went through a stretch of shooting the ball very well for like 3 games, has on the whole not shot the ball well since the All-Star break. And so those 2 guys, you had a game like Golden State where Russell Westbrook was tremendous. He was at his best. But those 2 guys just couldn't get anything going. And offensively, it's just going to be hard for them to beat anybody if they don't get significant contributions from at least a couple other guys with Westbrook.
Eric, I thought it was maybe, troublesome, maybe too strong a word, but it was definitely a little bit off-putting to hear Paul George talk about something being wrong, something mechanical, however, those different phrases he used. What do you think is happening there? Is something in his head? Is he injured in some way that we haven't been able to? Maybe he doesn't even. I don't know. What do you chalk that up to?
I think I'm not entirely sure what it is. Post All-Star break, he's been horrendous. Going into the All-Star break, he was probably the hottest 3-point shooter on the planet. People can attribute that to a couple of different conspiracy theories. He went home to L.A. and got all the L.A. love and got lazy or started thinking about other things. And it's affected his play. I just think that he came back and his shot wasn't falling, and the next thing a 2-game slump or a 3-game slump turns into 2 months. Right. So we've seen him have some games where he can get a little bit hot. I think he's out of rhythm. I think he's stepping into some jump shots that he typically doesn't take because he's pressing the issue. He said he wasn't pressing. I totally think he is pressing. But, and I think that it's a combination of things, too. I think it's not just the 3-point shot, but it's the continuation of an entire season of not getting the calls that he thinks he should get. We've seen Paul George time and time again press the issue at the rim, trying to get his offense going. And, frankly, he just hasn't got a lot of calls in terms of the amount of times he goes to the rim. So he's flustered right now. He's frustrated. I think the frustration has to do more with his offense being off than it does with him being elsewhere or not being focused on what the task at hand and what he has to do. So I don't think we should jump to any conclusions about how he feels about the Oklahoma City situation. Yeah. I just think he's in a horrible, horrible slump. And it's troubling with 79 games in and, a week away from the playoffs that, your best 3-point shooter in terms of volume is struggling the way he is.
Yeah, and at this point, the die is cast. I mean, this is it, Brett. I mean, and it's obviously Russell Westbrook's going to do what Russell Westbrook does. He's shown that, changed the guys around him. He's still who he is. But if this team is going to win a playoff series, they got to have help. I mean, we saw that with that Warriors game. Warriors didn't have a full complement of players, had guys hurt, had guys out. And yet they had enough to overcome the Thunder, even on a night that Russell Westbrook was spectacular.
Yeah, and also Golden State didn't have anything to play for. Not really. They're locked into the 2. They are trying to get a little bit of a rhythm back before the playoffs start. They know they're not going to have Steph Curry for the first round, so they're trying to figure out who they are without Steph Curry, how they can play their best without him. So there's motivation in that sense. But the Thunder playing at home in a game that they really needed to win. They needed to get that game because they can put themselves in a very strong position. San Antonio goes out to L.A. and loses on back-to-back nights. if you'd won that game, you have a chance to be in a much, much better position. So you've got to get contributions. Look, Steven Adams wasn't great against the Warriors. He was okay, but not great. Westbrook was terrific. And as you said, Westbrook's going to do what he does. That includes some games every now and then where he's going to take some questionable shots. He's going to turn the ball over too much. They need some consistency somewhere else, not only to help him on the nights when he's great, but make up for those nights when he's not.
You know, Eric, we've talked about the fact that this team needs to win, too, to secure its spot. What Houston does, you know, a little bit up in the air, how they're going to approach that game this weekend. But how, I mean, aside from the needing to win to get into the playoffs, could there be some added importance for this team just to have a performance against the best team in the West, win that game, kind of get back in a rhythm? You know, it seems like if you're the Thunder, you're running out of time to sort of feel good about where you are. That would be a team, yeah, you're supposed to win those next two, but if you beat Houston, even if they're not playing their full roster, that's at least a mental good feeling, I would think.
Yeah, and I thought that was what was going to kind of carry them into the Golden State game, because they put in a good mental close against New Orleans. It would be good to see that again, considering, you know, how they played against Golden State and how much those guys struggled shooting the ball. They struggled shooting the ball against New Orleans too, but they were able to close out the game. It's a completely different feeling when you're able to win a game, get Paul George a key three-pointer at the end of the game, as opposed to the Golden State game where you just couldn't hit anything. That can be a confidence builder, going to Houston, winning that game against, you know, the best team in the league record-wise, regardless of how many guys they play. So the Thunder just needs to get some kind of consistency in terms of play these last three games. And look, even if they lose to Houston, if they play the right way, I think it would be beneficial for them in the long run going into the playoffs if they go to Houston, lose, and say, look, we generated the right shots, we got some shots to fall, we just lost close or we lost down the stretch, and that's nothing to be disappointed about because we played the right way we needed to against a team like that.
All right, guys, lots more playoff talk to come, but let's shift focus a little bit and talk about postseason awards. Brett, you actually are voting this year. Eric, you voted last year. So the challenge of figuring out MVP, Coach of the Year, Defensive Player of the Year, on and on, first team, second team, third team, All-NBA, all that sort of thing. Let's start with the MVP race. I think most people think right now it's James Harden's to lose.
Yep.
Is that where you are, Brett?
Yeah, you're right that a lot of these things are going to be hard. That is not going to be hard. I mean, James Harden has, you know, I think there's a growing sentiment because there is always a need to create a little bit of drama around the MVP race. There is a growing sentiment that LeBron James is a viable candidate, especially if by some chance the Cavs win out. They could actually have more wins than they had last year, I believe, if they win all the rest of their games. LeBron has had one of his best years, and we all know that if you're just ranking the best players, not the most valuable player ballot, LeBron is still the best player in the league. And so there is an argument there. I think Anthony Davis's case has faded just a little bit. I still expect him to be in the top 5. I don't think the backpack they sent to the Oklahoman is going to sway me up to number 1 or number 2 anymore. You know, I think Damian Lillard is going to be in that mix somewhere. But I don't think anybody at this point is going to take it away from Harden. Not only has he had a great year, but they're the best team in the league, which I think is going to matter to people. And there's a sense that, look, Harden could have won this thing twice before, and I think this is sort of, it just feels like it's his year.
It seems too, I'm not voting, so haven't thought super deep about this, but you know, when I think, Eric, about whether you're talking about LeBron or Harden, in the West, we know what a slog it is. I mean, look at the teams that are going to finish without home court advantage likely in the playoffs in the West. The East, while improved in some ways, just doesn't seem to have that depth. Do you think that weighs into this? Or is Harden just such a runaway winner at this point, people aren't really having to even think about those sorts of things?
Yeah, I think what plays into it more than anything is that we just haven't seen the Rockets go through prolonged slumps at all this season. All the other candidates that you'd have, whether it be an Anthony Davis or a LeBron James, you know, earlier in the season it was Kyrie Irving until he got injured. You know, even a guy like, I don't know, say Steph Curry. We've all seen prolonged slumps from some of those teams, or them play down a level when guys got injured, or when their teams were in a situation like Cleveland was, where their defense has just been atrocious pretty much all season.
Yeah.
So the Rockets have not been that team. They've lost 2 games since basically since Andre Robertson got injured at the end of January. The Rockets have lost 2 games in a 2-month span. James Harden has been at the center of that. Even when he's been injured, you know, the Rockets have kept their flow going, which, you know, usually that you would count that against an MVP candidate, but he's been healthy for the better part of the season. They've reached just incredible heights. They've far exceeded anybody's expectations in terms of what they could do this season. Nobody thought that they would actually seize the #1 seed from Golden State. You could chalk some of that up to injuries. But, they beat Golden State straight up this season, too, in a series. They beat them, I think, 2-3. So, look, it's James Harden's award. He deserves it. And, he should definitely be the runaway winner this season.
Obviously, Russell Westbrook factored into this discussion a ton last year, not so much this year. But, Brett, a guy that was likely to figure into of the year awards is Paul George in Defensive Player of the Year. Will he get much traction in that voting?
I think he'll be a guy who's kind of in the mix. The Thunder certainly will tell voters about his resume. He's had a good year defensively. I think what hurts his candidacy as much as anything is that the Thunder was a pretty good defense and at times a very good defense. And then Andre Robertson got hurt and it really fell off the table. And it's kind of worked its way back since then to a little bit better level of respectability, particularly since Corey Brewer came along. But in terms of the numbers, still nowhere close to where it was with Robertson. And so I think people are going to look at it and say, well, Paul George is an excellent defender, but the guy that really made the defense go was Robertson. He was the guy who would have been the Defensive Player of the Year candidate. I think a strong candidate probably right now, given where the Thunder figure they probably would be if Robertson had played the whole year. I think he'd actually be your front runner, given that I think the guy maybe most deserving right now is Rudy Gobert, who's missed a bunch of games. If Robertson had stayed healthy, I think he probably would be the winner. And I do think that will hurt Paul George's candidacy to some extent.
Yeah, it's interesting, though, what could come out of the all-defensive teams, though, Eric, because there have been a lot of injuries. So you're likely to see some guys that have missed some chunks make maybe second, maybe even first team. I mean, you talk about Gobert missing games. Could Robertson even be a guy that gets some traction and maybe lands on one of those all-defensive teams?
Most certainly, okay. and he should, because this is a season that is unique in the sense that more impactful players, whether it's the all-NBA teams, MVP candidates, or all-defensive team candidates, have been injured for significant periods of time to where you have to factor in time on the court, impact that those guys had while they were healthy, as opposed to a season where everybody was healthy or a majority of the good players were healthy. Andre Robertson is one of those guys. It's clear the impact he has on the Thunder when he's on the court. The turnover rate is sky high. He makes Paul George a better player. He makes Steven Adams a better player. He destroys pick and roll. He destroys plays before they even start. And the same thing goes for a guy like Rudy Gobert in Utah. You see Rudy Gobert's the way that the Jazz have improved when Rudy Gobert is healthy and he's able to play for them. The Thunder was fortunate, to not play against Rudy Gobert, I think at least twice out of the 4 matchups, maybe even 3 times. And in the one time they played him, granted it was early in the season, he completely shut off the paint. So you have to factor that in when you're talking about all defensive candidates. And I think that Rudy Gobert, guys like Joel Embiid, and Andre Robertson are 3 clear first-team all-defensive NBA candidates or just guys that should be on the team, regardless of how many games they played.
When I think about the challenge of doing this, you saw it last year. How do you come up with, your first, second, third team, all-NBA, obviously all these individual awards. Brett, what do you think for you is going to be the toughest thing to come up with as you go through that ballot?
Well, probably it's going to be narrowing down to 6 guards. I mean, I think
for all NBA.
Yeah. That is going to be brutal. There's going to be some guys who have had great years who don't even sniff one of those teams. I mean, you think about my first team guards right now, and I think the guys who will end up the first team guards would be James Harden and Damian Lillard. I think you got to factor in Russell Westbrook probably as a second team guy. And then you've got so many guys. Steph Curry missed a bunch of games. How do you factor that in? DeMar DeRozan has had a great year. Kyle Lowry's had a great second part of the year. Those guys have to be in the mix somewhere. You got a ton of guards. Victor Oladipo needs to be in the mix somewhere. So you're going to have guys like a guy like Drew Holiday in New Orleans, who's had a really good year. He's got basically no chance of making one of those 3 teams. And in any given year, he would be a clear-cut all-NBA guy, but it's just not going to happen this year. Narrowing that down is going to be tough.
All right, give Brett some advice. I mean, you had to go through it last year with tough decisions. What do you have to do when you sit down and you've got tough calls to make on that ballot?
Follow your heart. It'll never lead you astray. And I'd probably
Thank you, Obi-Wan.
I'd probably stay off the Twitter for the duration of the regular season, so you will neither be swayed nor made to feel guilty about any particular decisions you come to. I think your gut is typically the way to go when it comes to life decisions, trivia, and voting for NBA awards.
That seems solid.
Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to watch the games. because I'm not a blog boy. I'm going to look at the games and not just see the stats. And if you know what happens if you watch the game? The game will tell you what to do.
Yeah, yeah.
That's what Russell Westbrook
The
says.
game will tell you what to do.
Like literally every time we talk to him.
The game will tell you what to do. Hey, guys, quick question about Westbrook. I think I know the answer to this, but this is a guy that still statistically is making a run at another triple-double average. Unlikely, but still in the cards of possible. If that happens, Brett, do you think it sways anybody on any of this stuff?
It's an interesting thing. I don't think so. And what I think this ultimately says is that he didn't win the MVP last year based on averaging a triple-double. It helped. I'm not sure he would have won it if he hadn't done it. It would have been close. I think what really swayed voters, because he was averaging a triple-double most of the year, and he wasn't the MVP favorite until very near the end of the season. The thing that happened was he became so incredibly dominant in the clutch. He won games, and they ended up with 47 wins at a team that I think a lot of people didn't think that was going to happen with. This team might end up with 47 wins too. So I think even if he gets to that triple-double average, it would take a lot of work on the glass to do that. I still think people would look at it ultimately and say, they added Paul George, they added Carmelo Anthony, they put some better bench pieces in theory on the roster, and they still ended up with 47. And he didn't kind of dominate games in the same way in the clutch. I don't see it.
All right, before we go, guys, quickly, where do these guys finish? What seed you got, Eric?
I've had him at 6 for quite some time. I don't think that's going to change. It's the unfortunate task of having to go to Portland in the first round, but if Portland doesn't have a healthy Damian Lillard, that changes things too. Now we have seen the Thunder lose to Portland without Damian Lillard this year, but that was a one-off game. At home, oh boy. But if you can get a series where you've got a less than 100% Damian Lillard, and you have the Thunder still going in with what they feel is a playoff advantage. They've talked about this all season. 3 guys who can create their own shot. You've got a better bench than you had last year. I know Enes Kanter's gone, but you've got Raymond Felton, who solidifies the point guard spot. They just didn't have anything close to that last season. You got Jeremy Grant, who's turned himself into a good player. You figure his minutes will be up against Portland because they're a good rebounding team. They have a lot of energy coming off of their bench and in their starting units, so Jeremy Grant's minutes probably up. I think the Thunder would stand a better chance against Portland in a playoff series than they would or they have in the regular season.
All right, he's got him at 6. Brett, you going higher, lower?
I'm also gonna say 6. I think there's so many possibilities right now, and I think 5 and 6 and 7 are all kind of bunched up in terms of being their most likely statistical ones based on all the analysis of what's going to happen in each game. That's probably the most likely. I wouldn't be shocked if they got to 4. I wouldn't be shocked if they slide to 8. What's interesting to me is if they go into those last couple days and they're kind of they're sitting between 7 and 8, it's going to be real interesting to watch Golden State and Houston and see how much do those teams want to play the Thunder, because they have some control over, maybe if you're Golden State, you say, look, we're going to win our last game of the season. We're going to try to win and shove these guys off on Houston. If you're Houston, maybe you're not scared of the Thunder, but maybe you think they match up the best with Golden State, and so you'd like to steer them into that Golden State game. That'll be really interesting if they fall below 6.
You know what? I know people would love to see the Thunder and the Warriors in the first round. I'm not so sure the Warriors are that stoked about it. And maybe the Thunder is okay with it because of the injuries and whatnot, but the drama that would surround that, I'm not real sure the Warriors are keen to that.
I don't think the Warriors care.
I think here's what I would say.
I really don't think the Warriors care who they face in the first.
That may be.
I think the Warriors are confident they can beat anybody that they play. But if they have some choice and it comes down to would you rather play Denver or Oklahoma City, they'd rather play Denver.
Yeah, I would agree with that. All right, like I said, lots left to talk about when it comes to the playoffs, the postseason. We'll continue to have that conversation both in the Oklahoman and on News OK, so be sure to stay with the best coverage team anywhere at newsok.com and every day in the Oklahoman.